David Foster Wallace fans, we are breaking down his biography today. Every Love Story is a Ghost Story by D.T. Max. And this was such a detailed biography. And I'm so excited to be able to dive into authors that we know a bunch of personal information about. For the past 9 months, I've been doing hundreds of videos on Cormac McCarthy, and we know little to no biographical information about him. So, being able to know about all of David Foster Wallace's promiscuous escapades, his favorite books, what he did for these 3 months of his life in Tucson, is such a relief. Because literary analysis becomes much funner when the author is screwed up. When I think of Wallace, Hemingway, Heidegger, Hunter S. Thompson, all the degenerates, it makes me happy to know that I can do some armchair psychoanalysis on them. And most of the time it's right. And with Wallace, it's really right because he's such a maximalist when it comes to his writing. He uses so many different aspects of his personal life within his major landmark works. And he really didn't produce that much fiction. Of course, we have Infinite Jest and The Broom of the System, his completed novels, and various short stories. But all in all, Wallace has released less than 1 million words of published work. And so let's start talking about the biography. And I'll be going to be going over the different phases of his life over the next year or so while I'm covering Wallace at length. But here are just some of my initial thoughts that I had rereading his biography. First of all, there's a certain pressure that comes when you have smart parents. Like, I'm going to have kids one day, and I think about all the time how I'm going to teach them this, and we're going to read Haruki Murakami and Robinson Jefferson, blah, 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 and they're going to be at least decent writers. But I've dated girls somewhat like Wallace at university who had parents who were like very smart and very good writers or philosophers or whatever. And whenever you tried to read their work or maybe critiques one of their thoughts or something, they would just shut down and freak out because a lot of people are not very gentle with their teaching and gentle with their application. Susie Wallace, I think that's her name, David Foster Wallace's mom, was what he calls a snoot, and she was very anal about David's language and, whether it be oral or written. And these sort of early critiques and high expectations in terms of, the intellectual path create problems most of the time because unless David took the path of being the philosophy king, going in, getting a PhD and doing all that, then any other path would be a failure because he never kind of learned to express himself creatively, in a creative manner in the way that he needed to. And his initial outlet for that was drugs. We hear in the book that somewhere in late middle school and early high school, Wallace started to smoke and drink alcohol. And this creates a bunch of problems because we have a genetic talent who has very smart parents who are helping him along. He's going to a pretty good school where he's being supported by all his teachers and everyone knows he's really smart. But where is that release? But genetically, like as a human, David Foster Wallace is somewhat sensitive, is a creative individual who is prone to addiction and like all these other things. And so, in my opinion, like the best outlet for someone like that would be, very non-competitive practices, something like a very gentle martial arts or going outside or like doing outdoor sports a lot that really aren't competitive, like backpacking, skiing, yoga, like whatever. But instead, Wallace focuses his outdoor recreation and his physical attributes on tennis, which is one of the most competitive sports in the world because tennis is somewhat of a rich sport. People get private lessons and do training, as we see in, Infinite Jest. It gets very meta, and Wallace was aspiring toward that. And so both aspects of his life were striving toward high expectations and high dreams, and he never had and the only way he could get an outlet, and the only way it seems like he knew how to, was through womanization and drugs. And wow, I mean, that is great. Like I said, from a biographical point of view, that's what we want to see. We don't want to see David going on a walk in the woods. We want to see him spiraling and having a hard time. And this is all a testament to the Tao, to language being an issue, being a virus in the mind that sometimes needs to be shut off. Earlier on this channel, 4 years ago, that's how long I've been doing this, I did a series on a book called The Artist's Way, which is a very famous creative like recovery program where you like get out of artistic or writer's blocks. And one of the exercises is that you spend a whole week without reading anything, not reading text messages, not reading anything online, any books. Like you spend a whole week just relaxing and doing other things, not filling your brain with any information. And as someone who is constantly reading, I read while I shave, I read while I'm in line, I listen to audiobooks when I go to work. Anytime I can find a time to consume information, I am doing it. And what one of the biggest breakthroughs I've ever had in my life is during one of those weeks. I've done it a couple times, and every single time it's changed my life. Because one of the other ideas in there is you don't watch TV, you don't do anything with technology. So living a tech-free and reading-free week really opens up your mind to different possibilities and things you like to do. And so it seems that David never did that, and he took refuge in tennis, the TV, and drugs. And so as we kind of transport, I'm just going over some of my general thoughts of in the main points of his life. So he goes to Amherst, which is, a pretty prestigious college. And once again, the competitive spirit comes back again because David has a couple mental breakdowns at his time during Amherst where he has to leave school. Like he's doing like just the competition and everything happening drives him to have to leave. And he lies about what's going on. He doesn't want to tell anyone because he thinks it's going to ruin this image of him. The other students view him because he's doing so well and has such good grades as this kind of magnificent figure, as this creature. And even at the end of his college tenure, his roommate and best friend through college did like a double thesis, one I think on like something in the humanities and one I think being fiction. And so Wallace took that to the next level and did two theses, one being the broom of the system, like a rough draft of it, and the other being his thesis on like an aspect of the mathematics of philosophy or philosophical, whatever you want to call it. And so this hyper competitive urge, it never leaves in Amherst either. And in general, it doesn't seem like he's having very much fun. It seems like when people are seeing him, at times he's either very high or very low, going through problems. He did have a couple girlfriends during this time, but this starts, from what I can tell, his general detachment from women. And the women that he was with and throughout his life, some were good and some were bad. But in general, I think we can blame him as a womanizer and a person who really has a detached style of being in being in a romantic relationship, because you can't go 0 for 50 and blame everyone else. And like I said, that's fine. I like that more. When I call someone a womanizer, I don't have any opinion on it. It's good for him. That's what he was, he was going after beautiful women. So then after college, this is where things get interesting. And like David Wallace, whatever we want to call him, starts to float in this bubble. And this was partly because he didn't know what he wanted to do. So while he was at Amherst, he started to get really into fiction writing and trying it. And he realized that he wanted to be a fiction writer more than being a philosopher or an academic. And so this is the 80s. And so like the mid 80s. So he decides to apply for an MFA program. And we're about to see, as I've talked about many times before, why MFA programs are very problematic. He was, working toward publishing The Broom of the System and getting in advance. And he was actually accepted to the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is the most prestigious in the world. And instead, he opted to go to the University of Arizona in Tucson, which I think is really funny, which is also where a lot of Infinite Jest takes place. And he went there because he was told they have a very like free they had a very free flowing attitude to what you were going to write. Like at the Iowa's Writer Workshop, and this is at a lot of MFA programs, there are certain professors and they have a similar style and want you to write a similar way. I had a very similar experience to this. My professors, Douglas Unger and Donald Revell, both were, a lot bigger and more famous in the 80s. Unger was nominated for a National Book Award and was a finalist. But when I would be in their workshop, and now they're in their 70s or whatever, they would think that stories would need to be written in a certain way. And so I would turn in something that was experimental or not aligned with that and just get slashed and not be like, my work wouldn't be elevated. It would just be cut down and like try to be formed into what they wanted it to be. And instead, your job is to try and help it. And that's the problem with a lot of programs. And that's why you need to go somewhere where you can align with someone. But that is very rare that you're going to be able to do that. And most of the time, there's just like one person at a program. And my argument all the time with MFA programs is like, why not just make friends with the people around the world that work on that like write in your style and can help you elevate it instead of trying to go to one place? And people are like, I have my tuition waived and I had the time to write. It's like, bro, someone giving you $15,000 a year, which is or even 20, which is the most you'll ever get, and you're having to teach classes, is a bad deal. There are cruiser jobs online in 2023 that you can get that will easily pay you that much and will require about 5 times less of stress. Anyway, so Wallace gets to the program and he suddenly realizes that the person who told him this was actually now leaving the program, and that the new style on the block was something called minimalism. And Wallace is a maximalist. And so a huge problem started to be created because no one really understood what he was doing. A lot of the professors couldn't really help him, and he didn't want to adapt to their style. They thought that postmodernism was dead, and any new iterations of it were super silly. And so Wallace showed up, and he kind of had a honeymoon period for a while where he felt very good in Tucson, but eventually it started to decline. He got into a toxic relationship while he was there. It was even rumored that he was having sex with his older professor. He actually took over her apartment when she left. Anyway, there's a lot of rumors about what he was doing and who he was with. But in general, it was a somewhat productive time for him because he was isolated a lot of the time from other students, and he would just, live in these crappy apartments without TV, sometimes without AC, and he would just work hard. And so that's really the time where he develops the broom of the system. And some of the seeds for Infinite Jest start to be planted at this time too. He didn't know it was what Infinite Jest was going to be, something, and until maybe a couple years after he graduated. But some of the things he did there did end up in the book, and obviously Tucson is a big part of the novel. And DT Max, so like back to the book, like DT Max does a great job of describing all this, like having lived in Tucson, like he does a great job of describing what Tucson is like and why Wallace is having a good time and a bad time. And the research is phenomenal. Like he really went out and talked to a lot of people because he released this just a couple years after Wallace's death. And I think he talked to most of the major sources. So Wallace does get an advance while here. And this is, you could say, the peak of Wallace's career. He's doing well writing. He has a social life. He has friends. Even though he isn't happy with the people around him, he would try to return to Tucson multiple times in his life to get that nostalgic feeling back of being there with the people. Eventually, he graduates and he moves on. And this is such an interesting decision. He tries to go to Harvard to get a PhD in philosophy. He is one of like a class of 6 out of hundreds of applicants that gets selected. And this is where we start to see some of his erratic behavior. Sometimes during his MFA, like his classes, not just at Amherst, but at the U of A, he would question professors. He would call people dumb, and like he was generally somewhat unpleasant to be around. I don't know if anyone has ever met people like David Foster Wallace. I've been at university with people like this. Because I've read stuff like this, I know not to act like this, but the snootiness and like the arrogance to like bash on someone when you are coming to the class and willingly watching something is like really stupid. It's like people who make like raging YouTube comments. Like I know they're trolls and that's what we do. We just do anonymous shit posting online now. But having the audacity to shit talk in person and like be a weirdo is a whole different level. So when Wallace was at Harvard, he would storm out of classes with famous philosophers saying like this is all intelligible and like having fits, and he only lasted a couple weeks. And this was because he realized he really wanted to focus on being a fiction writer. And during this time, he basically suffers a mental breakdown. He has to be institutionalized. He threatened suicide. And basically goes to the loony bin for a while. And this is a big moment for him because he was drinking and smoking pot for years before this. And this is somewhat of a big turning point in his life. And it was going to take years to pull himself out of this. I mean, we're talking over a decade of like work to really, if not longer, if not more, close to 15 years of like trying and working out of recovery to really stabilize himself and find bits of happiness. And David picks up another surprising habit of reading personal development books. And this is something that continues for the rest of his life. If you look at his library at the University of Texas at Austin, he really relied on it. And his brain couldn't wrap around the simple aphorisms. And we'll kind of get into this later. But his mind, his intellect became so strong that he couldn't pull himself out of, depression, all these things, because it's like Occam's razor, that the simplest way to pull yourself out of these states is just through simple aphorisms and positivity and exercise, all the things we now know about. And so this was something else that was going to take Wallace over a decade to kind of come to terms with, is this kind of simplicity. And for years, Wallace had had a crutch on marijuana and booze, just depending on the era of his life. And these actually opened him up to be a better writer. Back at the late Amherst days and at the University of Arizona, he was like smoking a lot of weed because it showed him different pathways for fiction writing. And when he didn't have weed, he was drinking. He went to this writer's retreat and there was no weed available. So he was basically drunk for most of the time. And mentioning this happened around this certain time too. When he went to this big writers retreat and met all these famous authors, he couldn't believe that they had this celebrity. And he went to this photo shoot with some of them in New York, and he ran away during the photo shoot because he couldn't handle like the anxiety of being famous and people having to wanting to know him and doing like being on a magazine cover. Another thing that was big for Wallace in rehab was that he started to encounter a different class of people he had never encountered before. Because once he got out of rehab, he couldn't stay for any longer. He started moving through a series of halfway houses and having to hold down jobs, working security jobs, living with a bunch of ex cons and convicts that we see displayed in Infinite Jest a bunch. And what this creates is a contrast of the Harvard philosophy department, his tennis friends, Amherst, and the Midwest. And this is a very humbling experience just for anyone. Like everyone, I'm sure, listening has been on their high horse before and been knocked off. Maybe you had to go work a job you didn't like with people who you thought you were better than, but you're there and you have to deal with them and you're just the same as them. And this was magnificent for Wallace's writing career because eventually, for months, he wasn't writing, but he got a hold of a typewriter and stuff later. And after this big drugged out period at the Granada House or whatever we wanted, the halfway houses he had to live in, he eventually pulled himself out and had, you could say, one of the more productive times of his career, but not without fault. I mean, there is some scenes in here, and like I said, I'm just overviewing a lot of this. But for instance, his relationship with Mary Kerr, where he had a gun and he was going to kill her husband. He was stalking her, throwing stuff at her, maybe even abusing her, like just acting completely crazy. And I can't forgive him for any of that. But this is also the path of trying to become great at something. And that's why on this channel, I'm trying to promote something different. For so long, we have thought in the intellectual community as things, especially kind of starting with David Foster Wallace, that we need to read all these books. I mean, I spent years reading, over 2,000 books, like dedicating my life to reading and literature and thinking that I was going to fill something in my heart. But at some point I realized, and because I thought I was going to be the best, I was writing and reading all the time. One day I'll be a great writer like all these guys and be a great philosopher or whatever, the best literature professor in the world. But once I got to know great writers and, professors and people who were artists, I realized that to become in 2023 really great at something, unless you get lucky and you're like the marketing niche person, requires so much dedication and effort that it's ridiculous. Because the only way to guarantee that you make it in 2023 is to be undeniable. You just have to be so good that they just send you through, kind of like a David Foster Wallace. I hear that all the time, that people are like, you could be a great writer and not be discovered in 2023. But there are so many publishing, agents out there. There's so many agents out there that would love to get your book published if it's good enough. And because they get a cut of the money, that they will sell your book as hard as they can. And if it's not good enough for one of the many publishing houses to think it's good, and the many editors and connections at those places, especially if you go through multiple agents to get your book published, then there's probably something wrong with the book, or just us as a society isn't ready for it yet. But then you just need to accept that you're going to be a martyr for this greater cause of literature. So the quest to becoming great, as we've seen not throughout Wallace's entire life, of even becoming an above average writer, is almost useless, because there are certain things that you can do in 2023 that are much more effective. For instance, if you want to talk about literature, like you could do something like I'm doing. I'm just a small pup in the big sea of YouTube, but you could share any type of knowledge online and teach hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. There are some booktubers out there that are more influential, or are easily more influential than any professor in the world. I know Jordan Peterson is a polarizing figure, but for decades he was in a university classroom and at his office with his private practice, really not making that big of an impact. He was helping a lot of people and doing this and that, but once he started getting into online publishing and trying to focus on educating a worldwide audience, he's now reached hundreds of millions of people, I think. And Jordan Peterson is not the smartest person in the world. He's not the best writer in the world. He's nowhere near the best psychologist. Like, he has a bunch of flaws. He was on drugs, and he's, I think, way too political. He's got all these problems, but he still has the ability to make a big impact. And people, we don't need to make as big of an impact. We don't need to become famous and have to deal with all that. We can make, small impacts ourselves now and live a very balanced life. That is the luxury that we have in 2023. And so I feel interested in why people become obsessed with Wallace. And this is something we'll be talking about. But the Wallace bro trope is real. There are so many guys and so many white men who just love David Foster Wallace. And they're always pushing it on to everyone, me included. Look, I'm about to make hundreds of videos on the guy. But I think the reason we do that, and one of the reasons we like Wallace, yes, he is a great writer. Is he the greatest writer of all time? I don't think so. But it's because we want to be able to write like this. We want to be able to have that impact, that mind blowing impact, to be able to write something so great that most people can't understand it or can't fathom like what is going on, and to be able to blow people's mind, to make them cry and contemplate reality and question literature in general, all in one book like Infinite Jest, or even his nonfiction essays, like to get to the top of the mountain, because we imagined the rewards at the top. And David Foster Wallace was not a person who was shy of taking up the rewards. I mean, throughout this book, we just hear of these sexual escapades, whether they're, I mean, he just, all these random artists who, some are big now, some are kind of no names, but he's like, she gets with this lady named, blank, blank, blank. And I look her up and she's like a hot girl who's now an art, who's now a famous artist. I'm like, they just have a one night stand, and Wallace was just doing this all the time. Like, he'd attend these parties and leave with a girl. Almost after a lot of his readings, he'd be like seen leaving with women. And I don't know, been called a hagiography before, which is a biography that paints a person in like a way too positive of a light. And DT Max does at times like explore Wallace's dark side, and he doesn't necessarily call them out. I think it's really like feminists and that whole crowd, the SJWs, really trying to have a biography that's overly critical of Wallace. But I wonder how much of Wallace's life and persona was just a like a character. Because what I've noticed about a lot of his relationships, they were passionate, not always honest. And as someone who's dealing with addiction and a mental disease, this is something that happens. This is something that happens to almost anybody who becomes a celebrity or a person with power. You start doing things that don't feel like yourself. And like the most extreme example of this, or one of them, is like Ernest Hemingway or Yukio Mishima in literature, who like create these characters, maybe even out of like schizophrenia, to the point of their own death. But what is interesting about all three of those people I just named is that they all committed suicide in the end. And when you look at kind of the list of authors who've committed suicide, a lot of them share a very similar story of kind of living and building this character. And Wallace, who is so meta, not just about how he, if you watch like his interviews, he like talks this, and he's like, and so I imagine these thoughts are going through his mind. And I bring this up because after this point in David Foster Wallace's life, once he kind of recovers, this is where things start to get really patchy, because he gets a job teaching somewhere near his hometown in the Midwest, at a university teaching job. And he moves there and he starts to work on Infinite Jest. And there's kind of this lull period where he's working on this big thing, and he buys a house and he's being responsible. He gets a couple dogs. He's recovering, going to recovery meetings, and is being sponsors for other addicts, and is like doing a pretty good job at everything. But when you write a book like Infinite Jest, like when you stare into the abyss stares into you. And his critiques of entertainment were ones of his own, because he was a television addict. And I can only imagine with how open he is to influences and his imitation of other authors, and him never really developing a core persona of his own through like individuation in like things like I was saying earlier, in like more of the yin arts, like martial arts, or like long-term relationships. I think that also, most importantly, because he was on antidepressants, a pretty bad one this entire time, it's seemingly his life is floating in this kind of ephemeral space, and he's wearing masks. This is something we'll explore further. So at the University of Illinois, whatever sub-branch of that, he has a very productive time. He obviously writes Infinite Jest there. If you look at a lot of his syllabuses from that time, he does a great job. He was a very great professor. I mean, holy crap. He would read everyone's papers 3 times and give great responses. And eventually Infinite Jest comes out, and it causes a bunch of problems because it's such a big book. And when books come out, it creates a need for a tour. And then his nonfiction career blew up. And after that, things honestly got better for him, because, I'm skipping a lot here. One of the things I want to talk about is his just rapid decline at the end of his life, because things are going well for Wallace, but maybe they weren't, because like when we look at The Pale King, which is over here where my hand is right now, he was stuck on that novel for years, because Infinite Jest comes out and he's trying to work on a new piece of fiction, not stories. A lot of the stories that were in Oblivion had been written even before Infinite Jest, and he was trying to come out with this new big thing, but he was having so many problems. And when you look into the David Foster Wallace archive, which I went to while I was in Texas, briefly for a couple days, and you look at like his journal notes, he was like very frustrated, and it was taking him much longer to produce something in the Pale King that you could say is maybe not equivalent to Infinite Jest. And to his standards, he was probably at best years away from completing it. And to connect all these points, I think that him building these masks, him having this hyper competitive mindset, and him achieving fame were the dark triad when he tried to get off his medication. Because when he tried to go cold turkey and get off of all his antidepressants, and it ended up not working, and he declines and kills himself. But I may be speaking nonsense here, but I feel like those three problems, which are axiomatic problems in his life, dealing with fame and the gaze and the idea, him dealing with the character and who he really is, and it never being created, the bandana, all these different things, and him dealing with the hyper competitiveness and the high expectations of his parents. He, near the end of his life, was barely on speaking terms with his mother. I mean, they weren't very close anymore, because he felt resentful about all this and his relationship with her. And for someone who is so sensitive and all these things, when you have problems that are that big and they all come flooding in after decades of holding them up, I would just assume when you add that, on top of the fourth thing, which is a writer's block, which is these high expectations, and you can't even write anymore, that it seemed like there was no way out for Wallace. He was writing about these overwhelming feelings, like he just wants it to end, that he can't find any source of happiness. And this is probably very neurological, obviously, but in my personal experience and from what I've known from a lot of people who've been depressed and as someone who's gone through mental health issues before, if you find pillars and you resolve your problems and you work through them and you don't try to avoid them and you do natural and good things and surround yourself with positive people, you usually don't end up killing yourself. But in the end, David Foster Wallace killed himself and left a big legacy and a lot of unfinished work behind him. And so expect a ton more of David Foster Wallace content soon. I'm going to be flooding it. I have so much to talk about, but I just wanted to let you guys know. So my rating is I'm going to give this an arousing 7. The biography is very complete. Max did a lot of his work. I could see how it's somewhat of a hagiography. And there were also some elements I felt like could have been explored further or could have been reflected on with some creative liberties. But that's just me, because when I one day write the Cormac McCarthy biography, I'm going to include all the Freemasonic stuff, the Jeffrey Epstein stuff, and everything else that maybe isn't true, but does make things much more fun. So I will see you guys in the next David Foster Wallace video. I'll have the playlist /podcast down below. Peace.